How do we understand a civilization that can no longer explain itself? For centuries, travelers moving through Egypt encountered one of the most remarkable landscapes on Earth. Massive temples rose from the desert. Monuments covered with intricate carvings stood beside the Nile. Tombs, statues, obelisks, and ruined cities testified to a civilization that had endured for thousands of years and produced some of the most recognizable achievements in human history. Yet there was a problem. The monuments remained visible, but their meaning had largely disappeared. Across the walls of temples and tombs appeared countless inscriptions written in a script known today as hieroglyphs. These symbols covered columns, gateways, statues, and sacred spaces throughout Egypt. They seemed to preserve enormous amounts of information about the civilization that had created them. But nobody could read them. For generations, scholars, travelers, and local inhabitants could observe the symbols without understanding what they said. The inscriptions survived physically, yet the knowledge required to interpret them had vanished. The words remained present before human eyes, while their meaning remained inaccessible. This created a strange situation. Ancient Egypt was not completely lost. Its monuments still stood. Its cities could still be visited. Its artifacts could still be collected and studied. Unlike civilizations that had disappeared entirely beneath the ground, Egypt remained visible. And yet, in an important sense, it was silent. People could describe what they saw, but they could not easily know what the civilization had intended to communicate about itself. The voices of its rulers, priests, officials, and ordinary inhabitants seemed trapped behind a barrier that no longer possessed an obvious key. As a result, much of what people believed about ancient Egypt depended upon interpretation, speculation, inherited traditions, and accounts written by outsiders. The civilization could be observed, but it could not fully speak for itself. This raises a broader question. How does a civilization become inaccessible? How can a society leave behind monuments, texts, and physical evidence on a massive scale, yet lose the ability to communicate across time? The story of the Rosetta Stone is often presented as how scholars deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. But it is also about something larger. It is the story of how civilizations preserve memory, how knowledge disappears, and how humanity sometimes recovers access to worlds that once seemed permanently beyond understanding. Before the ancient Egyptians could speak again, it is first necessary to understand how their voice was lost. The silence surrounding ancient Egypt did not emerge because its monuments were destroyed. It emerged because the chain connecting one generation of knowledge to the next was gradually broken. For much of Egyptian history, hieroglyphs formed part of a larger cultural and religious system. Writing was not simply a practical tool for recording information. It also possessed ceremonial and symbolic significance closely connected to temples, priesthoods, royal authority, and religious life. The ability to read and produce these inscriptions depended upon institutions that preserved specialized knowledge across generations. As long as those institutions remained active, the meaning of the symbols remained accessible. But civilizations are not static. Over centuries, Egypt experienced repeated political, cultural, and religious transformations. Foreign dynasties ruled the country. New languages became increasingly important. Greek influence expanded after the conquests of Alexander the Great. Later, Egypt became part of the Roman world. The society that had originally produced the hieroglyphic tradition gradually evolved into something different. The decisive changes emerged not through military conquest alone, but through shifts in everyday cultural life. As Greek became widely used for administration and communication, fewer people relied upon the older writing systems. Hieroglyphs continued to appear on temples and religious monuments, but their practical role became increasingly limited. Knowledge that had once been supported by broad institutional structures depended upon a progressively smaller community of specialists. The process accelerated as religious transformations reshaped Egyptian society. During the first centuries of the Christian era, traditional Egyptian religious institutions steadily declined. Temples that had preserved ancient practices for generations lost influence or ceased functioning altogether. Priesthoods disappeared, ritual traditions weakened. The communities responsible for maintaining knowledge of hieroglyphs became smaller and increasingly isolated. Eventually, the system that had preserved the script could no longer reproduce itself. The symbols remained carved into stone, but fewer people could interpret them. Knowledge that had once passed from teacher to student across centuries gradually reached an endpoint. The final individuals capable of reading the script died without transmitting the tradition further. By the 5th century, the ability to understand hieroglyphs had effectively vanished. What remained was a civilization surrounded by its own words, yet unable to read them. When a writing system becomes inaccessible, entire worlds of information become difficult to recover. Historical records, religious ideas, political decisions, personal identities, and cultural assumptions may continue to exist physically while becoming intellectually unreachable. The information survives, but the means of interpretation disappear. This reveals an important feature of civilizational memory. Knowledge is not preserved merely because it is written down. It survives because communities continuously maintain the ability to understand what has been written. Once that continuity breaks, even the most durable monuments can become silent. For centuries, Egypt's inscriptions remained visible across the landscape. The challenge was no longer preserving the words, it was recovering the ability to hear them. Ancient Egypt surrounded its observers with monuments, inscriptions, and artifacts, yet the civilization continued to resist direct interpretation. Scholars could study the physical remains of the ancient world, but the writing covering temples and monuments remained inaccessible. Then, in 1798, a new development altered the situation. That year, Napoleon Bonaparte launched a military expedition to Egypt. The campaign formed part of a broader struggle between France and Britain, but it also carried an intellectual dimension. Alongside soldiers, the expedition included engineers, surveyors, artists, scientists, and scholars tasked with studying the history, geography, and culture of Egypt itself. The military campaign ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. But during the expedition, a discovery occurred that would eventually transform the study of ancient Egypt. In 1799, while French forces were strengthening defensive positions near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta, soldiers uncovered a dark stone fragment that appeared to contain an inscription. At first glance, the object seemed unremarkable compared to the vast temples and monuments scattered throughout the country. Its significance lay not in its size, but in its contents. The inscription appeared in 3 distinct scripts. The upper section contained Egyptian hieroglyphs. The middle section used Demotic, a later Egyptian writing system employed in everyday administration and communication. The lower section was written in ancient Greek. This immediately attracted attention. Unlike hieroglyphs, ancient Greek could still be read. Scholars therefore suspected that the 3 inscriptions might contain the same text expressed in different forms. If that assumption proved correct, the stone might provide a bridge between a language that remained understood and one that had been silent for centuries. For the first time, the possibility of deciphering hieroglyphs appeared more than speculative. The problem was not yet solved. No one could simply read the ancient symbols. But the discovery suggested that the barrier separating modern observers from ancient Egypt might not be permanent after all. A civilization that had remained silent for centuries had left behind a clue. The challenge now was determining whether anyone could use it. Possessing the clue did not mean possessing the solution. The Rosetta Stone suggested that a connection existed between the known and the unknown, but it did not automatically reveal how that connection worked. Scholars still faced the central problem that had frustrated generations before them. They could see the symbols, yet they could not understand their meaning. The challenge proved more difficult than many initially expected. One reason was that hieroglyphs appeared unlike most familiar writing systems. The symbols often resembled people, animals, plants, tools, and other recognizable objects. For centuries, many observers assumed that the script functioned primarily through symbolic or allegorical meanings rather than representing the sounds of a spoken language. If that assumption were correct, decipherment would become extraordinarily difficult. A symbolic system can potentially contain countless meanings. The same image might represent an object, an idea, a religious concept, or an abstract principle depending upon context. Without access to the original tradition, determining those meanings becomes extremely uncertain. The first challenge, therefore, involved understanding the nature of the writing system itself. Scholars began comparing the three inscriptions on the Rosetta Stone in the hope that patterns might emerge. Because the Greek text could be read, researchers could identify the general content of the inscription. It appeared to contain a decree issued during the reign of Ptolemy V, a ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom that governed Egypt after the conquests of Alexander the Great. This provided an important clue. If the texts communicated the same message, names appearing in the Greek section might also appear within the Egyptian sections. Proper names possess a useful characteristic. They are often transferred between languages rather than completely translated. A ruler named Ptolemy in Greek would still need to be identified in Egyptian. Attention increasingly focused upon groups of hieroglyphic symbols enclosed within oval shapes known today as cartouches. Researchers suspected that these cartouches might contain royal names. Among the scholars working on the problem was the English polymath Thomas Young. By comparing the Greek and Egyptian texts, Young succeeded in identifying several connections between particular symbols and sounds. His work suggested that at least some hieroglyphs possessed phonetic functions. The script did not operate solely through symbolic imagery. The insight was important, but it did not yet fully explain how the system worked. The decisive breakthrough emerged through the efforts of the French scholar Jean-François Champollion. Unlike many earlier researchers, Champollion approached the problem with extensive knowledge of Coptic, the latest historical stage of the Egyptian language. He suspected that the ancient inscriptions might preserve linguistic continuities extending across centuries. Building upon previous discoveries, Champollion continued examining royal names preserved within cartouches. As more examples became available, patterns began to emerge. Certain symbols appeared repeatedly in positions where particular sounds should occur. The evidence increasingly suggested that hieroglyphs could represent spoken language directly. The script was neither purely symbolic nor purely phonetic. Instead, it combined multiple methods of communication within a single system. Some symbols represented sounds. Others represented ideas, objects, or categories of meaning. What had appeared confusing partly reflected the complexity of the writing system itself. In 1822, Champollion announced results that demonstrated a coherent method for reading the inscriptions. The barrier that had separated modern observers from ancient Egypt began to collapse. Decipherment did not occur in a single moment. Years of additional work remained necessary. Scholars still had to refine translations, test interpretations, and expand their understanding of the language. But the essential breakthrough had occurred. For roughly 14 centuries, no one had been able to read these inscriptions. Now, for the first time since antiquity, human beings could begin reading them again. The question was no longer whether ancient Egypt could be understood. The question had become what Egypt would reveal once it could finally speak. The decipherment of hieroglyphs solved a linguistic problem, but its consequences extended far beyond language. Ancient Egypt had existed in a peculiar position within historical understanding. Its monuments remained among the most impressive ever constructed. Travelers, rulers, scholars, and explorers could stand before temples, tombs, statues, and pyramids that had survived for millennia. Yet much of what those structures meant depended upon interpretation from the outside. People could observe Egypt. They could not easily hear Egypt explain itself. The breakthrough achieved by Champollion and the scholars who followed him began changing that relationship. As translations improved, inscriptions that had long appeared as mysterious symbols gradually became historical sources. Walls, monuments, stelae, tombs, and temples contained far more than religious imagery or decorative carvings. They preserved names, titles, events, decrees, rituals, political claims, administrative records, and descriptions of the world as ancient Egyptians themselves understood it. One of the most important consequences involved historical chronology. Before decipherment, many rulers of ancient Egypt existed only as uncertain figures whose relationships to one another remained difficult to reconstruct. Historians possessed fragments of information preserved through Greek and Roman authors, archaeological remains, and scattered traditions, but large portions of Egyptian history remained incomplete. The inscriptions helped fill many of those gaps. Royal monuments identified pharaohs, recorded achievements, commemorated victories, described construction projects, and established connections between successive rulers. Gradually, scholars gained the ability to reconstruct political histories that had previously remained fragmented or obscure. The effect was not unlike recovering chapters from a book that had long survived only in damaged form. The recovery extended beyond kings and dynasties. Religious beliefs became easier to understand. Ancient Egyptian ideas concerning divine authority, the afterlife, ritual practice, and cosmic order could increasingly be studied through the civilization's own texts rather than through speculation or external accounts. Egypt was no longer merely being observed, it was beginning to explain itself. Administrative systems also became more visible. The inscriptions revealed aspects of taxation, governance, law, economic organization, land management, and bureaucratic activity. They provided evidence about how institutions functioned, how authority was exercised, and how one of history's longest-lasting civilizations maintained itself across centuries. Even ordinary individuals emerged more clearly from the historical record. Many inscriptions did not describe famous rulers or major political events. They recorded personal dedications, professional roles, family relationships, occupations, achievements, and religious activities. The decipherment therefore expanded historical understanding not only of Egyptian elites, but also of countless individuals who had otherwise remained anonymous. The scale of the transformation was enormous. For centuries, the monuments of Egypt had functioned almost like evidence without explanation. Observers could see the results of the civilization's achievements, but access to many of the ideas, assumptions, and intentions behind those achievements remained limited. Decipherment altered that balance. The physical remains of Egypt no longer stood alone. They could increasingly be interpreted alongside the words left by the people who had created them. This changed more than the study of Egypt itself. It transformed historical methodology more broadly. The breakthrough demonstrated the importance of primary sources in understanding the past. Historians naturally rely upon artifacts, architecture, archaeological remains, and accounts written by outsiders. But whenever possible, civilizations are most fully understood when they can be examined through their own records. The Rosetta Stone helped restore access to precisely that kind of evidence. It reduced dependence upon speculation by expanding access to direct testimony. The ancient Egyptians did not return in any literal sense. Their world remained separated from the modern era by thousands of years. But historians could increasingly examine that world through the words left by the people who had lived within it. A barrier that had separated the present from the ancient world for more than 1,000 years had finally begun to disappear. The story of the Rosetta Stone is often remembered as a triumph of decipherment, but its deeper significance lies elsewhere. At its core, this is not simply the story of how scholars learned to read an ancient script. It is the story of the relationship between memory and understanding. Civilizations preserve enormous amounts of information about themselves. They construct monuments, write texts, record events, establish institutions, and leave physical traces that can endure for centuries or even millennia. These remnants often create the impression that the past survives automatically once it has been preserved. The history of ancient Egypt suggests otherwise. The inscriptions remained, the monuments remained, the words remained. What disappeared was the ability to understand them. For more than 1,000 years, vast quantities of information survived in physical form while remaining largely inaccessible in intellectual terms. The problem was not the absence of evidence. The problem was the absence of interpretation. This reveals an important limitation of historical memory. Information and understanding are not the same thing. A society may preserve records without preserving the knowledge required to interpret them. Texts can survive while languages disappear. Institutions can endure while their original purpose is forgotten. Cultural practices can remain visible long after the assumptions that gave them meaning have faded away. The continuity of civilization, therefore, depends upon more than preservation alone. It depends upon transmission. Knowledge survives when each generation maintains the ability to understand what previous generations attempted to communicate. Once that chain breaks, even the most durable records can become silent. The Rosetta Stone became important because it helped restore that connection. It provided a bridge between a world that remained understood and one that had become inaccessible. The achievement did not recover ancient Egypt itself. The temples, rulers, priests, and communities that produced the inscriptions remained part of a distant past. What returned was something different, the possibility of understanding. And perhaps that is the broader lesson. Civilizations are not remembered simply because their monuments survive. They are remembered because later generations retain the ability to hear what those monuments were trying to say. The Rosetta Stone reminds us that preserving the past is only part of memory. The other part is learning how to read it.